across ancient Egypt, they found a bunch of tools. So they found some, copper chisels, bronze chisels, very primitive stuff, some wooden, squares and plumb bobs, pounding stones, flint chisels. So those are the tools that are found. And in general, it's like the orthodoxy here and the academia will do everything they can to just hammer everything you find into this box and say, these are the tools we've found, so therefore everything's made by these tools. Now, outside of that, there's a whole realm of what I would call machining marks that exist all over these sites in Egypt. There's a place called Abu Sir that's been closed to the public for more than 100 years. You have to get special permission to go there. It's one of my favorite sites. It's an old kingdom site, like 5th dynasty. And all over this site, you find amazing evidence for massive circular saws. You see machining marks. There are these tube drills. I've got like an hour-long documentary just on the tube drills because there's been an argument going on for 150 years about the tube drills. There is evidence for very sophisticated and powerful tools that is etched into these artifacts from the very earliest points in Egypt all over the place. And a lot of these things, they disappear in later periods of time.
Go back to that image, Jamie, that you just had. Look at that.
Yeah, so here's an example. I didn't send you any of the machining marks, but I can show them to you. So we had to get to the industrial age, and develop sort of mass manufacture and engineering for us to even recognize what we're seeing here. Wow. So he found there's a famous core. It's called Petrie's core number 7, and it's a drill core from one of these holes. It's in granite, and it's located in the Petrie Museum. And this museum is one that actually allows research appointments, and you can analyze it. And it's been analyzed several times. There's been an argument that's been going on for literally 150 years about this core because what Petrie found and what Chris Dunn later verified. Yeah, that's Petrie's core number 7, exactly right there. That, in fact, might even be Chris Dunn's photo. Those that groove that goes around it, very obvious striations, right? Mm-hmm. So it's been incontrovertibly shown that that's a spiral. It's a spiral. So it's not like just horizontal striation. So if you can imagine the way we do it today, we have tube drills and core drills, spins really fast, makes lots of little marks. There's been studies done looking at those sort of marks. That's not what we're seeing here. What we see here is a continuous spiral groove of at least 2 points, so it's a twin spiral, that runs down the length of the core. Now, from that and analyzing that, you can determine a few things. Things like how fast was this drill, or how quickly was this drill penetrating the granite. And Petrie and Dunn both analyzed it and looked at it. Well, it's about a 1 in 60 rate. So for each, say, 60 inches of horizontal travel, it's going 1 inch into the stone. So imagine that. So if you take a spiral and straighten it out, and you just imagine, all right, 60 inches this way, you're getting 1 inch of vertical travel. That figure is 500 times greater than we can achieve today in terms of how fast it penetrates the granite.
500 times greater.
Now, it doesn't mean it cut quicker. It could have been moving slowly, like it might have been turning slowly.
Right.
But it's penetrating the granite at a rate far greater than what we can achieve with our technology today.
This is why it's so important to bring outside eyes into this, whether it's an aerospace engineer. Like this is, going back to Troy, that was discovered by a businessman. He wasn't an archaeologist. That's something that most people don't know. It's like when you bring an outside set of eyes with different sets of experiences, they'll pick up on things that others wouldn't.
Look at that image, that all the spiral lines around that. That's just amazing.
Yeah, so you can go there, and I intend to do this. I might be in the UK this year, and I intend to do that. It's called the cotton wrap test. You can actually, under a little microscope, run a piece of cotton through that groove. Now, they actually took it a step further, and they made a latex molding of it, right? And so then they sent it to Chris Dunn. The Petrie Museum did this. And then he cut reference holes in it, cut it out, and then geometrically proved basically that this is a spiral groove. Like it starts above the line and ends below the line. He showed that that's it. And what I would love to see happen is we could get this core and then scan it with that structured light scanner, because it will put that stuff to bed, no problem. Like there's, as far as I'm concerned, this is a spiral groove. The case has been closed, but people still argue the point. But it's 100% an indicator of some form of technology that's far away beyond the primitive stuff that we attribute to the dynastic Egyptians. So to me, it's an indicator that, and I don't think the dynastic Egyptians, they don't describe having this type of capability. We've never found any tools from them that can do this type of thing. So I think what we're looking at here with dynastic Egypt is a story. It's a longer timeline. It's a story of inheritance. I think they inherited a lot of artifacts, potentially some architecture, potentially like parts of the pyramids or that type of thing. And then that's where their culture grew from that. I mean, they themselves describe their history as going back nearly 40,000 years. Like it's they themselves look at themselves, they look at them like a legacy culture. This is in the Palermo stone, it's in the Turin papyrus, the priest Manetho talks about it. There's a lot of different, so that actual, the yellow image in the center, that's the latex core, no, up to the right, that one. That's the latex core, latex molding of core number 7. But the crazy thing is too, this is the only core that's really been analysed. Like these things, they're all over the place. Like lots of museums have them. I'd love to see a body of work be built up with true analysis of it because...
Do they all have similar markings on them?
Well, yes. And so you can see the holes on a lot of the sites that seem to have a very clear striation on them. Some of the tubes, the actual drill cores, if you like, seem to have it that way. There were other techniques used. So the argument that how the mainstream archaeologists describe them solving this problem is they had a copper tube and they got sand and they put a rock on top of the tube and a bow drill and they just went back and forth with this. And they did some experiments and grinding works ultimately because sand has little chunks of like quartz and corundum in it, but it takes days and days and days to cut this much.
Right.
And the markings and the machining doesn't look anything like what you see in the ancient examples. And what's more, solving this problem is they had a copper tube and they got sand and they put a rock on top of the tube and a bow drill and they just went back and forth with this. And they did some experiments and grinding works ultimately because sand has little chunks of like quartz and corundum in it, but it takes days and days and days to cut this much.
Right.
And the markings and the machining doesn't look anything like what you see in the ancient examples. And in it, but it takes days and days and days to cut this much.
Right.
And the markings and the machining doesn't look anything like what you see in the ancient examples.
Look at that image that all the spiral lines around that. That's just amazing.
Yeah, so you can go there, and I intend to do this. I might be in the UK this year, and I intend to do that. It's called the cotton wrap test. You can actually, under a little microscope, run a piece of cotton through that groove. Now, they actually took it a step further, and they made a latex.
Right.
And the markings and the machining doesn't look anything like what you see in the ancient examples. And what's more...
This is the paper 7th of Petrie, published by the Scientists Against Myth team. They have a YouTube channel. They've done many experiments. Now, this image, which looks nothing, apparently these modern experiments are nothing like the impossible ancient machining marks. And, well, here's just one image. We come down, and that's the image there. So maybe Joe Rogan's not familiar, but Uncharted X, Ben Van Kerkwijk was looking right at the image and was fooled by this modern replica, this experiments he knows very well that exists and is very careful to censor on his own page. So it's the experimentalists, but they've done it. They're able to fool him in front of audience of millions of views.
Look at that image that all the spiral lines around that. That's just amazing.
Yeah, so you can go there, and I intend to do this. I might be in the UK this year, and I intend to do that. It's called the cotton wrap test. You can actually, under a little microscope, run a piece of cotton through that groove. Now, they actually took it a step further, and they made a latex molding.
Right.
And the markings and the machining doesn't look anything like what you see in the ancient examples. And for each, say, 60 inches of horizontal travel, it's going 1 inch into the stone. So imagine that. So if you take than we can achieve today in terms of how fast it penetrates the granite.
500 times greater.
Now it doesn't mean it cut quicker. It could have been moving slowly, like it might have been turning slowly.
Right.
But it's penetrating the granite at a rate far greater than what we can achieve with our technology today.
ايه ده؟ في ايه؟ الله ما تخافش. ايه الحكايه؟ مين انت؟ عايز ايه؟ بالراحه عليا يا عمي.
Much.
Right.
And the markings and the machining doesn't look anything like what you see in the ancient examples. And what's more, and what's kind of interesting here is that the drill cores that they found, they're tapered. So actually they taper in like this. The holes are straight, the cores are tapered. So it means that the tool itself must have been had like almost like a cone shape. And the thing that, because some people say, well, those lines could have been created when the tool was removed. And I'm like, no. If you think about a tapered tool like this, the second you take any pressure off it, the whole tool removes itself from the surface of the stone. So those marks can't be made.
We have drilled through about 48 millimeters, that is, we are slightly ahead of schedule. We have drilled through about 48 millimeters, that is, we are slightly ahead of schedule. And discuss the fruit of our righteous labor. Well, the fruit looks like that. First, we can see here that it slightly broadens to the bottom. When discussing such granite cores from ancient Egypt, it is widely stated that they broaden or alternatively narrow to the bottom and that it is impossible to get this shape, using the method which we have used a moment ago. It is stated that some high-tech tool is needed for this purpose. And why is it shaped like that? Because the drill bit is wobbling during drilling. And at the top it is wobbling heavier, because at the bottom it is thrusting against the material. Wobbling means traveling like that? Yes, it is traveling and thus grinding more granite at the top. That's why the bore is V-shaped in the cross-section. And this is our counter-argument to the frequent statement that ancient Egyptians could not make things like that. In practice, there's nothing difficult. In this sample, it is clearly seen that the bore matches its bore hole perfectly. And it is clearly seen that the bore is broader at the top than at the bottom. Well, I hope this question is resolved. But I anticipate one more question about the sharpness of the cutting edge. Here is the cutting edge. Yes, it is argued that if one tries to drill granite with a copper tube, it will go blunt very soon. But here we see quite the opposite. Can you show this? Yes, the tube does not go blunt, but becomes sharper. In other words, our drill bit is self-sharpening. Yes, it is a self-sharpening drill bit. I'm not sure if it is visible here, but the wall thickness has decreased. When we measured it before we started, it was 1.8 millimeters. Let's measure it once more.
Она у нас 1,6.
1.6. So it turns out that the tube has become sharper. Yes, 1.6 millimeters. That is, 0.2 of a millimeter have gone at this depth.
Following in the example set by scientists against myths, I've repeated these experiments many times in many different types of granite using different abrasives to get different effects with the striations. These can be repeated. You can do them to order once you realise, you just change the grit size. There's all sorts of little nuances in the way that you drill. But for instance, when they say the self-sharpening, so there's a original copper tube, and there you can see how it self-sharpens, but also how the grit gets embedded inside. So that's one of the reasons why the copper will not you drill through the granite much faster than you drill through the copper. So again, whether it's a bow drill, top heavy, and it wobbles, it creates a taper. The very example they use of Dennis Stocks from that very old documentary, his core is tapered. Flywheel drill by the Scientists Against Myth, again, repeated many times. I'm more than happy to do a live stream with any of the Lost High Tech people and teach them or challenge them because they keep saying lies, and then they and just as an illustration, that wobble, that's what creates the taper. There's a few reasons that go into it, but the main one is the wobble. So the issue of the taper being some ultrasonic unexplained, no, it's inevitable from using these types of tools, the bow drill or the flywheel drill. The flywheel drill is depicted often, very often, and usually in association with vase making as well. Its RPM, firstly, the flywheel drill needs one person to operate, as where a bow drill really needs at least 2, but 3. And the flywheel drill has a much higher RPM, so it's a much more effective tool as well. So that, these tools were never found. Well, they were depicted very, very often. And all my cores are tapered. Here's just a collection of some of them. I've moved on to doing more complex, but it's the tapering of the cores is inevitable from using the tools, whether it's a bow drill or a flywheel drill, as depicted by the Egyptians. Now, you might think, well, Ben doesn't know about these experiments, and that's why many years after the fact, and only very recently, even very short time ago, he's still repeating this thing about the Core 7 and the impossible taper and unexplained and machining marks and the grooves being a spiral. We'll examine that in a moment because it's not a spiral. But Scientists Against Smith and myself and other people have tried to share this information, which he asked for, are heavily censored. It's Uncharted X's policy to suppress this information, not even slightly ashamed of it as well. So when there is no excuse for this. This is a scam.
Is that how did it become polished? Was it through polishing? Was it through? It certainly was not through grinding with sand and copper.
Right.
Because that's the core that I made, and to the right of it is the core that Dennis Stocks made.
Speaking of deception and censorship, I did a longer form video on it. I'll link all these in the description. Christopher Dunn just mentions the core that he made. Here is the tool that he describes. I go into more detail. The experiment is farcical to begin with, but his claims that he did this by hand are simply false, because one of the taper is one of the impossible features to do, and he even describes his own the core is essentially perfectly cylindrical. It has a taper on either side of less than 0.5 millimeter. Having used that tool extensively, and even especially the way he describes it, using it to and fro, it will have to wobble, it would have to create a taper. It's simply impossible that he did it, has claimed. Very obviously, unless someone can demonstrate otherwise, the only plausible explanation of how he was able to achieve that was by using a drill press or something like this, because the drill would have to wobble if hand operated, especially, he wasn't turning it in a single direction, he was even to and fro. Each time would throw the drill off. It's just physics, it's biomechanics, it would have to do that. And not to mention the slower RPM of how so very long it would take. And so, yes, he used a device like this to do that. And further evidence of that is the black mark, the staining, the burn mark in there, because when he first applied it, he was putting too much pressure on there. So Christopher Dunn's experiment is fake. If he was using, it's just, again, flywheel, the drill such as that, it's just going to have to wobble, top heavy, off centre, crank handle. There's no other way around it. So that's why it's very important for the house of cards that they speak of is actually they've got the house of cards, so the symmetrical statues, it's just false. Precision Serapeum, false, and Core 7 is absolutely false, and it's built on censorship and fake experimentation. And this will now lead us to, because everyone's going to, well, what about the vases? Well, we have a history of censorship and denial of the experiments that they asked for, and we have one of faking data. So in response to that, Christopher Dunn faked his experiment. It's cringe of how obvious it is. You just assume that someone's not going to check. And so the flywheel drill creates the taper. It creates the appearance of a spiral. We'll look at that in a moment. And after many years, finally, Christopher Dunn is being forced to address this issue, and the Scientists Against Smith going to the Petrie Museum to to look very closely at the core, and he's going to try and gaslight you in a different direction. But let's look at that in a moment.
This was featured on a video by a YouTube channel called Scientists Against Myth.
Okay.
Going back several years now, here we see some of the photos of the Science Against Myth team arranged, 2020, 2022. These are still now Christopher Dunn's been forced into it, but we still haven't, with the other experiments, they're still not acknowledging these because they know that this will ruin the grift. So here we see, again, just another example of those, striations that have incontrovertibly verified, geometrically proven. That's what they have there. You don't need, if they want to go to the expense of using an expensive, device and to measure it, well, as Ben said, you can go to the Petrie Museum and look at that. I'll link this as well, Out of Place Artifacts, 100 Years of Deception, by the Scientists Against Myths. So I go through all of these. They've examined the core, they've done the experiments, I've replicated the experiments, and again, open challenge to any of the defenders of, Uncharted X, Christopher Dunn. I'd love to see you repeat your experiment. We'll come up to that in a moment. But if you say, Ben says, he looks at the core and he's obvious, look at the amazing spiral, the thread around there. If it's so important, you believe it's important to answer these mysteries, you give this lip service to, I'm just searching for truth, let's find this out. Well, we can make them in real time and confirm it. But instead it's censorship, more censorship and denial and lying going on to all of these. It's a whole podcast industry now is Lost Ancient High Technology. So let's see what's going to happen. I don't believe anything will because it's a scam. So the issue of, here we see Chris Dunn with his jeweller's glasses winding the thread around. That is the Core 7 in Petrie Museum. He's reformatted his website so we don't see the Eric Wilson link as obvious, but we zoom in and, well, they get the thread around a few times. Now, we can explain that because the Scientists Against Myth, they could wrap threads around their cores. The cores I made, I could follow the traces around. Mine was not a high-speed, constant feed rate spiral. The distances between them are vary quite a bit. And, again, distances... Okay, now here you see the Eric Wilson one, and again, what's happening? We're missing to get them to fit in. Well, we have to miss threads. We have crossed threads as well. So if we're going to say, well, it's a 2-point spiral, then it should go around one in the opposite, one in one direction, one in the opposite direction, but what we have here on Core 7 is that it is not a spiral. And even before the more detailed analysis, this just should have just been dropped even earlier, but it's a core part. Again, missing threads to get that in there, crossing threads over. And so it is not a spiral. This should have been apparent before, but it's a very important foundation cornerstone to the impossible machining marks. Therefore, 40,000 ancient, in Egypt just inherited these things that can't be done by hand, but it can. This information is, of course, heavily censored. And even from other photos, you can, you trace the spiral around and you can see the gaps. Petrie even says he wrapped it around 4 times with barely an interruption. Well, so there are interruptions there, and even, again, before the examination was done by Science Against Myth, this thing is weaving all over the place. There are gaps all over the place. Now, in the Christopher Dunn interview on the Danny Jones one, he just shows this picture in the background and with the heavier blue traces, but what happens when we make it more obvious and more clear, it's a mess. It's not even close to a spiral. You can, with interruptions, you can find a spiral in there, but it's because you'll want to find a spiral in there. And so this, if Ben from Uncharted X wants to do a light spec top, super duper machines, go for it. But I'd be a great waste of money and time on his behalf, because this is what he's going to find. And so the tapering of core 7, not an issue. If you don't fake your experiments like Christopher done using Egyptian techniques, you will repeat the core and the spiral as well. Now, because core 7 was indistinguishable to Ben when he looked up, he's on Joe Rogan and he's looking at a replica and saying that the replicas don't match the machine marks. They absolutely do. Again, Serapeum, symmetrical statues, impossible precision, it's all false. And, well, they're going to have, it's taken them years to admit it. Now, Chris Dunn shows that Scientists Against Smith core, but if you watch the whole, he's just waffling on and he says nothing. And then when he does a recorded piece with Eric Wilson, and Eric Wilson says, well, the Fred, is the one that counts. Well, the Scientists Against Smith are my own cores. I can wrap a thread in the groove and find the appearance of a spiral.
And what's kind of interesting here is that the drill cores that they found, they're tapered. So actually they taper in like this. The holes are straight, the cores are tapered. So it means that the tool itself must have been had almost like a cone shape. And the thing that, because some people say, well, those lines could have been created when the tool was removed. And I'm like, no. If you think about a tapered tool like this, the second you take any pressure off it, the whole tool removes itself from the surface of the stone. So those marks can't be made by withdrawal of the tool. It's 100% something going on. And Petrie, back in the late 1800s, was scratching his head looking at this stuff, and he goes, there must have been a weight of 2 or 3 tons on one. Like he sort of said it was a jeweled tube of bronze that did this. But he was looking at it. He knew a mystery when he saw it, and he couldn't explain it.
What's the speculation? Like, what's the wildest speculation as to how these things were made?
Well, I'm pretty convinced that there was there's obviously saws and tube drills that are powered by something. Now, I think it may not just be pure friction. There might be ultrasonics involved. One of the whole interesting things